At the end of the day, we have to go and make life much more miserable for the bad guys in this space, particularly the cyber criminals, and we've got to make it much, much less lucrative.
This is Code and Country with host Ian L. Patterson.
Welcome to Code and Country, where we explore the intersection of cybersecurity, national security, and geopolitics. Our guest today is Michael Daniel, currently serving as president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a global nonprofit that enables real-time threat intelligence sharing between some of the world's largest cybersecurity companies. Before that, he served as the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator under President Obama, overseeing the national cyber strategy and leading the U.S. response to major incidents, including the OPM breach and the Sony attack. Michael, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So maybe to start off, I'd love to understand your journey, because you've worked at the highest levels of national security policy, but your path, I don't think, was necessarily a technical one that you took. So before the White House, I understand you spent over a decade at OMB shaping the intelligence and cybersecurity budgets. What first drew you into the space?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I mean, you're right. My path has been very meandering, and I come at the cybersecurity issues from much more of a public policy economics background and lens. Really, what got me into cybersecurity was that in the mid-2000s, the director of national intelligence at the time, Mike McConnell, came to the White House and said, hey, we need all this money for this thing called cyber. And during the briefings and other things, the director of OMB at the time, he nodded very sagely. And then as soon as the door closed, he was like, Michael, I didn't understand a word of what they just said. You need to go get smart on this cyber thing. And the more I sort of dug into this problem, the more I looked at it, the more interesting it was. And so I ended up sort of becoming the de facto lead for cybersecurity budgets, not just for the intelligence community and DoD, but for the government writ large. Because there really wasn't anybody doing that at the time at OMB. And so I really became kind of the lead for a lot of the cybersecurity spending, and as the issue continued to increase in importance and the Obama administration came along, I was really kind of the face of the cybersecurity budget world for OMB.
So it is funny, I have to say, because you mentioned Mike McConnell. Mike McConnell was our independent director and now retired and chairs our advisory council. But it is funny to me sometimes how many roads lead to Admiral McConnell
Yes.
at the end of the day. So curious, so from OMB, you took the cybersecurity coordinator role at the White House. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And what was your impression when you got into that role?
Well, again, this was an interesting opportunity for me to kind of change from a more budget and finance role to a much broader policy role. And I think what really struck me, at the time was, as I've said in other occasions, the good news was there wasn't a whole lot of policy development in this area, and the bad news was there wasn't a whole lot of policy developed in this area, right? So we were making up a lot of this as we went along. There wasn't decades of experience like you have in other areas for processes and procedures and other things. And so even the understanding of senior policy officials about how to think about this problem was still very new. And in fact, at the senior policy official meetings early in the Obama administration, everybody would show up and they'd be looking down at their pieces of paper because they were mostly reading off of talking points. Right. It was only after 3 or 4 years and several incidents that people developed a facility to be able to talk about the issues with a much greater degree of confidence, and sort of, even if they didn't understand all of the technical implications, they could at least grasp the broader policy implications that was going on. But that was an evolution that occurred over most of the Obama administration, and it was very fascinating to watch the policy apparatus develop a better facility for handling, cybersecurity problems. I wouldn't say we were, top notch by the end, but we were certainly a lot better off than when we started.
Thank you for listening to Code and Country, sponsored by Plurilock. If you're enjoying this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, or follow the podcast. And now, back to the episode.
So that is a fascinating lens. I'd be super curious. I mean, how did you see the evolution of handling those cyber incidents? Because I mean, you mentioned that you were there probably during the tenure of the Sony attack, probably
Yep.
OEM. Was there another big one while you were there?
Oh, I mean, I started with the DDoS attacks on our financial sector from the Iranians. We had the North Koreans doing the Sony pictures, Chinese theft of intellectual property. We had, all sorts of Russian antics, including, interference in the 2016 election, the OPM intrusion. Yeah, there were lots of them that we went through, and I think a lot of it was both just in sort of how you could frame and talk about the issues, right? Like how did you understand? How do policy officials sort of grasp and understand what a cyber threat is, right? But then even how do you think about it? Like what is it? So, the DDoS attacks on our financial system were actually an interesting case in point because we use that word attack because, by the way, just me personally, I really think we way overuse the word attack. A lot of things that we call attacks are really like your house wasn't attacked, it was broken into and robbed, right? A lot of things that we call attacks are actually intrusions or thefts or other things, and it confuses the language a little bit. But DDoS incidents are actually attacks because they're trying to disrupt, they're trying to cause harm, right? But even then, you start to think about it, and it's like, okay, we had debates in the Situation Room. Like, what is this? Is this the equivalent of the Iranians, like, doing sabotage on American soil with, guys that they disgorged from a submarine? And people were like, well, that's not really, that seems a bit extreme. Maybe it's more like they've paid a bunch of teenagers to drive up and down the street and play their radios really loud. But it's this struggle to sort of put the things that are happening in cyberspace into a framework and a lens that people can understand in the normal world. Now, in the almost 13 years since actually it was in August, so yeah, 13 years ago, people have become much more used to talking about cybersecurity incidents, and we've had ransomware, we've had other things, and so we don't have that same struggle now because people are much more familiar with it. But in 2012, it was still a relatively new thing. By the time you get to 2016, we've had a lot of different incidents that some of which we've talked about, and people have become, the policy apparatus has become much more familiar with talking about these issues and seeing them as a national security issue that needed attention from the senior policy officials. And that was a big evolution that occurred over the Obama administration, really.
Do you have an example of maybe something that happened in the early part of your tenure there, and then maybe a counterexample of how that matured during a follow-on incident?
Well, even if you just look at like the Chinese theft of intellectual property and trade secrets and other things, when we first started raising that issue, there was a lot of pushback from a lot of primarily the economic side of the administration that was like, well, maybe this isn't as big a deal as you think it is. Maybe, other things sort of outweigh it. And it really took a long time to sort of assemble all of the different pieces because any one individual incident probably wasn't all that important in the grand scheme of things. But it was only when you sort of assembled the entirety of what the Chinese were doing that you began to realize the scope and scale of the operations. In fact, I think my personal belief is the scope and scale of the operations were so big that even the Chinese, like central, like Xi Jinping and others didn't actually understand everything that was going on.
So we had Dmitry Alperovich from CrowdStrike on recently, and he pointed out actually that he was the one who coined the term the greatest transfer of wealth in human history has been from the Americans to the Chinese via hacking, which certainly was a soundbite that I heard a lot from even agency directors during that time.
Yeah, but it took a while to get there. I mean, Dmitry was actually ahead of a lot of people in sort of understanding what was going on from a holistic standpoint. But then once we finally made that connection, then we were able to convince people that this was a real problem. that we needed to address, then we were actually able to embed it in other parts of the policy process. And what I mean by that is then we started having it be part of all of the diplomatic talking points. So whenever any senior official went to Beijing, whether it was, the Commerce Secretary or the NASA administrator or whoever, right, was going over there, part of their talking points was, hey, this is a big problem, right? And the Chinese started hearing it from multiple different directions, and it became clear to them that unless they figured out a way to address this issue, it was becoming a major irritant in the bilateral relationship. And so you saw that sort of that evolution from not really understanding how this was a problem and what was actually going on to being a major part of the engagement with the Chinese, to the point where, we ended up with one of the senior Chinese officials coming over and negotiating that deal that happened right before the, Obama-Xi summit in late 2015. And that was a big change in maturity, over the course of several years.
How did the rise of ransomware change the thinking? Because I can recall at that time that cyber incidents, as you correctly pointed out, they're not always attacks, were largely defacements and disruption efforts, DDoS, DOS attacks, etc. We didn't see as much ransomware or extortion, but I mean, as we know, COVID in particular really kicked things into high gear, and we just saw a huge amount of ransomware. So I guess, how did the rise of ransomware change the policy conversation during your tenure?
Well, so that really occurred after I left the White House. In 2015, 2016, even, all the way up to there, ransomware was still, it was still like the bad guys would, lock up grandma's photos and then have her.
It was consumer oriented, not as
consumer oriented. Yeah, and they would, could you send us $500 of Amazon gift cards, right? It was still very sort of retail, individual focused. And really, when you look at the trajectory that then happened over the late teens and into the first part of this decade, the rise of cryptocurrency really supercharged that market, right? Because suddenly you had a way for the criminals to extort a lot of value in a means that was more difficult to trace, more difficult to stop, and could scale, right? Because it would be can't really ask for $100,000 in gift cards, right? I mean, like, that just doesn't scale. But suddenly, and if you try to do that through, fiat currency, there's a lot of controls in the financial system, and that gets flagged, and other things. But cryptocurrency then allows them to ask for these large sums of money in a way that the financial system is not designed to control. You couple that with a couple of organizational advancements in the cyber criminal realm, which is the sort of specialization because they've all read their Adam Smith, so they know how to run these things as businesses, and so they started diversifying and specializing, and this entire criminal ecosystem develops at the same time. So with all these affiliates and all this structure, and it's really becomes a big business, and that's the evolution you see sort of from 2017 to 2020, right? And that's when ransomware really starts to take off and become the problem that it is. And I would say that what's really changed is it took ransomware from kind of this minor nuisance, this minor kind of economic crime nuisance, to like a national security threat. Suddenly, you could now use ransomware to disrupt whole industries. We saw with like Colonial Pipeline that you could cause companies to take steps that would shut down critical infrastructure in a way that really caused a big disruption in society. And that was a very significant evolution particularly on the cyber criminal threat.
Well, and it also becomes a strategic issue. I mean, the transition from the retail-oriented, hey, send me $500 in Bitcoin, to taking down a major oil refining and distribution company. I mean, the anecdote that I remember from that time we're seeing stories of people panicked buying, gasoline and trying to transport it in plastic bags, which by the way will melt the bags. So that, there's several problems there. But it did become a strategic issue. How did that affect your thinking around policy, or even after leaving the White House, how has that shift informed your view on the industry at large?
Well, I think what it continues to, there's a couple of things that actually I think about in there. And one of them is that I have become convinced that we really have we have a structural problem in cybersecurity, which is that we have pushed the cybersecurity burden all the way out to the edge of the network, if you will, all the way out to small companies, individuals, all the way out. Everybody's basically responsible for their own cybersecurity, right? And that's probably okay for, JP Morgan Chase or Duke Energy or, Tata, right? They've got the capability to actually, the capability to actually invest in cybersecurity. But that doesn't work for most of the ecosystem. And so I really have become convinced that we have to really fundamentally rethink how we do cybersecurity, and we need to put much more of the burden of cybersecurity needs to go on the players that can actually take that burden on in an effective way.
And who is that?
I think so. First of all, some of it's the tech companies themselves that are producing the software. Like, I'm a big believer in secure by design. And I believe that we should hold software producers to the same kinds of standards that we hold other producers of other kinds of goods and services to, and there's some liability that comes with that, right? If you're an auto manufacturer, you don't get to just, flop a car out there and say, good luck with that. And by the way, here's some upgrades and we're going to patch this constantly. And, and anything that goes wrong, that's all your problem, right? Even if it was equivalent of a manufacturing defect. We don't have that same mindset in software because we still think of it as like this startup industry, like we're still in the 1980s or 1990s, and that it's completely different now. Some of it is to think about, okay, well, who's providing some of these services, right? How about telecommunications providers and managed security service providers and things like that. Now, this does not mean, by the way, that I think that all of the burden needs to be shifted, right? Just like you still have to lock your car, you still have to lock your house, you still have to take reasonable steps to protect yourself in the physical world. The same should be true in cyberspace, right? But I do think that we've put too much of the burden on parts of societies that would just never be able to handle that burden effectively. And then we wonder why it doesn't work very well. So,
yeah, I do wonder, though, if the car analogy is the right one. So at Plurilock, we work with predominantly businesses. We have a large public sector practice as well, but it tends to be big public sector, so large governments, large agencies. Even the smaller enterprises that we work with are still pretty large. But I often use the analogy of, imagine you're a big facility, right? Like a big manufacturing facility, which in our case usually is the case, because we do a lot in the smart manufacturing space. And cybersecurity is kind of like having one big building that you're supposed to protect, aka your corporate network. And we can talk about zero trust and defense in depth as well, and perimeter is now perimeter list, et cetera, et cetera. But for analogy's sake, we'll just say there's one big building. Cybersecurity is kind of like having a bad guy throw rocks at your windows. And I think the challenge with cybersecurity is that the expectation is currently that building needs to upgrade their windows and then continue to upgrade their windows. And those people are going to continue throwing rocks. And they're going to continue throwing rocks, and then they'll throw other things. So if you get bulletproof glass, they're going to figure out some other way of getting through that glass. And the thing that's missing in that equation, if I compare that against the physical example, right? The physical example is you have a corner store, somebody's throwing rocks at your windows. You call the cops. Yeah, sure, upgrade your windows, but you also call the cops so you can go after the bad guys so that they stop their attack. And I feel like in cybersecurity, there's while there's certainly good high-profile examples of either DOJ or whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the signals intelligence agencies, cyber command, et cetera, or the equivalents at other country levels, there's not as much retribution or the ability to actually stop the attacker from persisting their attacks. And so it does become a cat and mouse game where, yes, the technology vendors, they continuously have to upgrade their tech, but we're not actually stamping out the problem at the root. So anyway, that's just kind of what we're seeing. And, again, like I think Colonial was a good example where I can't remember which agency it was, but there was some success in recovering the ransom payment that was made and kind of going after the bad guys. But I think that's the exception, not the norm, where most of the time these bad guys are able to, persist. So anyway, just curious on kind of that dynamic of the equation.
Yeah, that's kind of the other half of the equation, if you will, which is, I think of it as cost imposition, right? How do we actually disrupt the bad guy business model, right? In fact, one could actually ask the question, like, why aren't there more cyber criminals? I mean, it's a great business model, and there are things that make that complex. And so one of the things that the internet has done, right, is just as it has allowed businesses to reach out and touch consumers directly, right, it allows the bad guys to do the same thing, right? And so the challenge, right, in this space is a lot of these criminals live in countries that for various reasons either do not want or cannot, impose costs on them. And so they create safe harbors for these criminals. And our entire law enforcement capability is built on the idea that you will arrest and prosecute the criminals. You are measured as a law enforcement official on how many criminals you catch and prosecute, not how much money you cost them, right? And so it has been difficult for our law enforcement agencies to make the shift in mindset and approach to think about, okay, we're probably not going to be able to arrest a lot. Great if we can. We will continue to try to put handcuffs on as many cyber criminals as we can. But we're going to have to recognize that a lot of them we're never going to be able to put handcuffs on. So you have to shift your mindset and think about, like, okay, how do we disrupt them in other ways? All right. Well, you're also very used to, as a law enforcement system, thinking about, like, I'm going to build a case with lots and lots of evidence, and I'm going to spend years building that case. Well, years in cyber terms is like, centuries in other policy contexts, right? So now you also have to shift your mindset to, we're not going to spend years building a case. We're going to spend a few weeks building enough capability to then go and disrupt what those bad guys are doing, right? That is a very different approach to law enforcement than we've traditionally had. And so it's taken us a long time. The FBI was finally starting to make that shift, I think. And the rest of the policy apparatus was really starting to make that shift in other countries as well, right? Because you can't just do this in the United States alone. You've got to get a whole bunch of other countries to go along with you.
Sure.
And you've also got to get the private sector to work with you, because a lot of the information that you need as a government is sitting in the private sector. So this poses a coordination and collaboration problem that's immensely complex. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've had such trouble starting to build the apparatuses that we need to actually go after this problem. But you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, we have to go and make life much more miserable for the bad guys in this space, particularly the cyber criminals, and we've got to make it much, much less lucrative. And we've got to get it to a point where it's not such a great business model to engage in. You're absolutely right. And we're still, I think, struggling to build the capability to do that. And in many ways, that's going to be the challenge of the mid-21st century, is how do you build that capability, both crossing the public-private divide, but also crossing international boundaries.
Well, I think also the separation between, is this an intelligence problem, is this a law enforcement problem, or is this a defense problem? And the answer, I think, is actually yes. And so you've got different agencies and, well, I'll say different stakeholders who have different capabilities, both technical capabilities as well as authorities to be able to do something. I do see some glimmers of hope on the horizon. I was particularly impressed at what the Australians did, going after the folks who took down some of their healthcare infrastructure and it was a horrific data extortion that occurred. And so the Australians couldn't necessarily put handcuffs on those folks, but they did dox them publicly and tried to impose cost on them through other channels. So maybe this conversation is actually a good segue to talk about the Cyber Threat Alliance. What is it and what are you doing there?
Yeah, so the Cyber Threat Alliance is an information sharing association. So what we do is we enable our member companies to share threat intelligence with each other. And to do that in both an automated and an automated fashion with raw technical intelligence, but also with finished intelligence. In some ways, you could think of us as an ISAC, right? An information sharing and analysis center. It's just that we're the ISAC for the cybersecurity industry. Our members are cybersecurity providers, so those that are providing cybersecurity services to others. So companies like Palo Alto Networks or Sophos, but also, companies that aren't quite household names, in other or in other regions, because we're international as well. And so when member companies join CTA, they agree to provide a certain amount of that technical threat intelligence on a regular basis, and in exchange, they get to access the threat intelligence that's been shared by everybody else. So one of the things that actually makes us a little bit different is if you join CTA, you're required to share. That's how we actually solve the free rider problem, is that you have to share a certain amount of that threat intelligence in order to actually stay as a member of CTA.
So this speaks to the collaboration problem that you were just mentioning. I guess, what's the relationship of the CTA to the public sector?
So we are partners often with public sector agencies. We have both formal and informal relationships with government entities, not just the U.S. government, but other responsible governments around the world, like the U.K. or Australia or Japan. They're not members of the alliance because that we restrict membership to, private sector companies, but we do have, partnerships with those governments, and so sometimes it's a little more formal, sometimes it's a little less formal. It's whatever the government agency wants.
So given that you're sitting in an information wealthy position, I almost dare not ask this question, but what keeps you up at night, given all you see?
So actually what worries me is the fragility of our technical systems, right? That we have engineered very heavily our technical systems for convenience, for speed, and we have not really engineered them for resilience. And, what worries me is the degree to which we've become highly dependent on these very brittle systems that, for all of the internet's resilience to disruption in some ways, like we are very vulnerable as a society to disruption in, cyberspace. And we haven't really thought as much about that. I sometimes, think about I joined the Office of Management and Budget in, essentially 1995. And, if the network went down, we just did something else for the day. We worked on our non-networked computers. We called people on the phone. We actually went and had an in-person meeting, it was annoying, but you still got a lot of work done, right? Now if the network goes down, if you lose the internet, you just stop. You can't even be effective at what you do. And so what used to be a minor annoyance is now like an existential threat. And we really haven't sort of made that shift to really think about it in those terms. Those of us in this industry, right, we live and breathe this every day and we know this, but I don't think this is broadly accepted as it needs to be. And so that's what really worries me is, that these systems are complex and chaotic in sort of the mathematical senses of those terms, and like we are like very dependent on these brittle, chaotic, complex systems that we don't really understand.
And depending on the industry and the workforce who built them are no longer there, and there's an absence of documentation, and there's a lot of duct tape and baling wire keeping these things together.
Yep, absolutely.
Michael, I super appreciate you taking the time. Where can people find either you online or CTA online? How should people engage with you?
Absolutely. So cyberthreatalliance.org. You can find us, that's our website. I'm on LinkedIn, Michael Daniel, Cyber Threat Alliance will probably pull me up. So that's really the best way to engage with us. We're always looking for new members. So if you're a cybersecurity provider of any kind, come talk with us. We're happy to chat with you about how you might fit into the alliance.
Amazing. Michael, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Code and Country.